Hello.
Hello.
You're listening to The Full Blossom of the Evening, a podcast about David Lynch and Twin Peaks.
I'm Indigo.
And I'm Hilary.
And listeners, we're going to tell it to you. We're going to tell it to you straight. Today, we're talking about
The Books of Fire Walk With Me.
It was Laura, and I saw her glowing. I saw her smiling. I feel like I'm gonna dream tonight.
Well, today's topic has a bit of a backstory, doesn't it?
It does. So, listeners, you might be thinking, what are the Books of Fire Walk With Me? Well, in January of 2025, this year, the Twin Peaks blog posted about a joint discovery by Matthew Haywood and Stephen Miller. In several scenes of Fire Walk With Me, Laura is carrying or reading a specific book. Haywood identified it as Volume 5 of the Home University bookshelf, and Miller patiently and painstakingly identified the story Laura is reading as The Rose in the Ring. We'll link to the blog post in our show notes so you can check it out later. In 2018, a post on the Twin Peaks blog by Stephen Miller identified another book as well that Laura carries in the film, which is William Saroyan's The Human Comedy.
We've read and discussed both of these books for today's podcast. Now, just to clarify for listeners who perhaps haven't listened to our introductory episode, we aren't arguing for or trying to prove intentionality with this discussion. We know that Lynch was deliberate and detail-oriented about props and set design, but we're not trying to convince you that every nuance of our analysis of these texts reflects his intentions.
We're going to approach our analysis of both books' presences and Fire Walk With Me in two layers. First, the superficial or more straightforward connections, and then deeper thematic resonances between each text and the film.
Instead of trying to prove intentionality with these thematic resonances, we're interested in how both the texts and Fire Walk With Me engage with similar questions about human experience. And we're going to start with The Rose in the Ring.
So, as we said, this was brought to our attention through the Twin Peaks blog, so very grateful for that post. This was fascinating and made for a great topic to dive into. So as we said, it's part of that home university bookshelf, but it's important that this is decidedly not a textbook, nor would it be necessarily age appropriate for a high school senior for school reading material. The Home University bookshelf was written according to its own advertising for little folk, meaning these were for elementary aged children. Volume 5 in particular is an anthology of tales and verse, like stories and poems for children, many abridged or excerpted.
We have the book.
Mm-hmm.
We just got it in the mail today. And it's even got songs.
Yes,
when I
was flipping through it, it's got all these like children's songs in the back.
And it's very heavy.
Yes.
Exceptionally heavy for poor Cheryl Lee to be carrying around so much in the film. Well, my mom had a book like this from her own childhood, and I remember reading it when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. It had like a single verse excerpt from Walt Whitman's Song of the Open Road, and then I remember when I was in college and was reading that poem, I was like, wow, this is much longer than I thought it was. It also, I remember, had a retelling of the story of Pandora. And it had an image that just, I can still see it. It's burned into my childhood retinas.
Like a scary Well, I guess it is scary.
It was scary. It was her opening the chest. And, so perhaps these kinds of anthologies of abridged texts were more popular in a different era.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is such a very interesting collection of stuff. Just when you're flipping through it, because, to prep for this, we had just quickly gotten copies of just the story itself. But this particular copy that she had is so full of many other very different things. Mm-hmm. It crosses a lot of different things.
So the book also wouldn't have been used in school. Mm-hmm. It is not a textbook. Although we see Laura Palmer carrying it in school, definitely not a textbook. It appears to have been a set of 11 mail order books for families without easy access to bookstores, looking for an affordable way to build a home library. The publisher employed door-to-door salespeople, and the books were shipped in wooden crates with the name of the series stamped on the side. I found a photo of one of these crates online. We'll put it on the Instagram.
Oh, definitely. Oh,
Yeah.
definitely.
Do you remember older relatives having collections like this in their homes, like sets of encyclopedias or anthologies?
Definitely the encyclopedias. Like, I remember that was such a big thing. Like, and like kind of a joke too. Like I feel like a lot of TV shows and movies, they play on that joke of like the traveling salesman trying to sell the encyclopedias and stuff.
That's what this sounds like to me.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
100%. And like, it does totally make sense that that's the context of why it's such a broad spectrum of content, because it's like, all right, so you've got all of these random stories that are not really connected, all these random songs and poems and stuff. And it does seem like you're just trying to like throw a little bit of everything in there. So if this was to sort of help, families that don't read as much sort of build up their bookshelf, I guess that makes sense. They're just looking for kind of like filler and just like content sort
Right.
of.
So I think the most basic reason for Laura to be carrying this book is it's really beautiful.
True.
I mean, aesthetically, it is a great prop. It is so much better than a chemistry book, for
Yes.
example. And I also was thinking that maybe it adds to the timeless feel of Fire Walk with Me's aesthetic and Twin Peaks aesthetic in general, that editions of a textbook are easy to identify and link to specific eras. So if Lara is carrying here a vintage anthology, it just puts this in the 20th century, and that's it.
Right. No, that's such a good point. And also, like, I would just say, obviously we'll post pictures of this, but just the color, like the tone of it aesthetically, it's very in the Twin Peaks universe of these like kind of earth tones,
Oranges.
yeah, green. Like it would look good with her clothes and the sets.
Yeah.
And it would look like it would fit in.
Now, later in the film, when Laura is reading from this book, she's open to a specific page in the story, and that story is The Rose in the Ring.
So this little story was written in 1854 by William Makepeace Thackeray, an English author famous for the satirical novels Vanity Fair and The Luck of Barry Lyndon. The 1975 Stanley Kubrick film Barry Lyndon is an adaptation of the latter.
Thackeray's prelude to this story states that it was written for a 12th night celebration when he was spending Christmas outside of England in a city where a bunch of English children needed entertainment. A governess, he claims, begged him to draw a set of 12th night characters. He did, and made up the story of The Rose in the Ring to tell about his characters.
So briefly, the holiday known as Twelfth Night is either January 5th or 6th, and since the 6th century in England has been recognized as the last day of Christmas celebrations. Traditionally, Twelfth Night was nearly as big a celebration as Christmas itself, and was marked with feasting, drinking, and all sorts of revelry involving masks, role reversal, and a general upending of the social order.
In the early 19th century, shops started selling printed sheets of what were called 12th night characters with drawings and descriptions. So these characters were exaggerated, buffoonish, satirical figures. The game was to cut up the sheets and distribute the characters to your party guests, either at the party or in advance. And then each guest would act out or even dress up as their randomly assigned character. I think we need to bring this tradition back.
I mean, it just sounds so whimsical and
It's fun. It sounds fun. So anyway, according to Thackeray's prelude, these little English kids in a foreign country were missing their printed sheets of 12th night characters from the shops, and Thackeray stepped in to create some for them.
The characters of The Rose and the Ring, then, are appropriately ridiculous. And the story is too. It's a fairy tale full of mistaken identities, temporarily usurped crowns, and reminiscent of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, with like fairy magic that gives a person irresistible beauty and charm. And in general, like, I think also there's a lot of stuff we saw that kind of reminded us of like Alice in Wonderland, just these over the top, really ridiculous characters.
Definitely. It's also so cute because it's interactive. There's one place in the story where Thackeray pauses and he suggests that children can shout out their favorite foods to include in a dinner scene. So it's a very lighthearted story. I mean, it isn't popular now.
Yeah.
Neither of us had heard of this before we took on this project, but it seems like it must have been popular during Lynch's childhood.
Yeah, this was something that I found online that I thought was so fascinating. Hayao Miyazaki included The Rose and the Ring on his list of 50 essential stories for children. And so then I was like, well, that's so interesting that, you know, Lynch would potentially put this in, and then also Miyazaki's talking about this, but this is something I've never heard about. So then I looked, and because I wasn't sure, and Miyazaki's birth year is pretty close to Lynch. He was born in 1941, Lynch was 1946. So then we sort of got to thinking about, well, maybe this was just more popular in their age range. This was a book, if he thinks it's an essential book for children, then maybe this was something that they were always reading as kids. You know, people were always talking about it. It was in every home.
I thought so too. Further evidence of that would be that in 1952, CBS television produced a dramatized version of The Rose and the Ring. And then the BBC did a 3-part version in 1953. I feel like this was a children's story that was kind of circulating in culture mid-century, maybe the way Disney-fied fairy tales do now.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and then in 1986, the Polish director Jerzy Gruza directed a 5-part dramatization of The Rose and the Ring. In 1982, Lynch told NME magazine that he freaked out over Gruza's film Deep End. So this was a director whose work he already knew and admired. So if somehow Lynch hadn't heard of the story before then, perhaps he did through Gruza's work.
Again, we can't prove any of this, and we're not trying to.
But I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, there are lots of ways that Lynch could have intersected with The Rose and the Ring. Yeah. So we're going to start now with the connections we see in Fire Walk with Me. We're starting with the most superficial.
So the title, obviously, The Rose and the Ring. Blue rose and alcove ring are new, important objects in this film, and they'll continue to be central throughout the return. Lynch could be underlining these two symbols with the presence of this story. The blue rose and the alcove ring are not going to be incidental details.
It's true, right? And because they're new and they're so significant, having this title in there, why not?
Right. And this is something like, I think that if you asked Twin Peaks fans to make a list of a couple symbols or objects that they think of when they think of Twin Peaks, they're going to say roses. They're going to say the ring. You know, like if you ask someone to do like fan art.
Well, think about like, how much how often they show up in tattoos.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like these are symbols that we obviously connect. So like when we saw that this story was called The Rose and the Ring, we were both like, oh my goodness.
I think every fan was. Everyone who read the Twin Peaks blog had that reaction.
Definitely.
Another wonderful detail is that Lara has the book open, as we said earlier in another scene. Now, the book is open on Lara's desk right after the hand washing scene.
Which I feel like we've talked about a couple times on here, how much that scene troubles both of us.
And this is also when Leland has that moment where he's rocking and seething on the bed, and then he suddenly softens, cries, and comes in and tells Lara that he loves her and says, "Good night, princess." Interesting language there.
Fairy tale language.
Now, right after this is when Lara cries, looks up at the angel painting, and whispers, "Is it true?" So, on the page that Lara's looking at is an illustration. And what's the caption of that illustration?
Angelica arrives just in time.
and she's holding in her hand a reprieve.
So is this foreshadowing? Laura's angel will arrive just in time, in a sense too, to save her from being possessed by Bob and escort her safely to the Red Room.
Yeah, I mean, there's that relief and joy on Laura's face in the closing scene, as if she has had a reprieve.
Yeah, I think, having it specifically open to that page is very interesting. We get to see it, we get that glimpse of it. So why wouldn't there be some intention? Perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, especially because she looks up at the angel painting right after that and whispers, "Is it true?"
Right.
She's looking for that reprieve.
Right.
Yeah.
She's saying, when will someone come for me and pull me out of this?
Well, so those are the superficial connections. More fun for us are these thematic resonances that we saw, though, in the story.
So there's the fairy tale. The original series of Twin Peaks has a lot in common with fairy tales. It seems appropriate that Fire Walk with Me would incorporate a fairy tale,
Yeah, the Diane podcast goes into this a lot. Rosie repeatedly recommended Marina Warner's book that's called From the Beast to the Blonde on fairy tales and their tellers. I read that book a couple of years ago, inspired by the Diane podcast, and, it was excellent.
One likely appeal of fairy tales in earlier times was that they gave strength and hope to powerless people, especially children and women. Fairy tale characters faced the kinds of miserable situations that were common to women and children in the earlier centuries, like desperate poverty, cruel stepmothers, forced marriages to men that they may have rightly perceived as beasts. Fairy tales often show those sort of plucky protagonists not just surviving but triumphing.
Yeah. I know that the fairy tale that best resonates with Laura's story is Donkey Skin.
Yeah.
Where you have the incestuous father pursuing his daughter who attempts to escape. But in this case, with the Rose and the Ring, Laura's fairy tale may be a source of hope and comfort the way her angel picture is. She's watching the guardian angel, and she reads a tale of a beautiful, unprotected heroine facing a lifetime of struggle and trauma, but it all leads to a happily ever after, at least in the Rose and the Ring.
Yeah. And I mean, this is something that when we were talking about it, I was like, yes, like I totally relate to that. Like growing up in a very unstable home, I really gravitated towards fantasy books, and especially ones where, this is why I loved Alice in Wonderland so much. I loved this idea of being able to be like these characters in these books and escape. I loved Matilda, and I think that's why these kinds of stories resonate so much. And any of these old fairy tales, it's just it's always some maiden who's down on her luck, probably has a bad home life or something, and manages to get with the prince or something. I've always loved a Cinderella story, any iteration of it.
Well, another thing that resonates in Fire Walk with Me from The Rose and the Ring is this idea of the fairy's gift of, quote, a little misfortune. So the premise of the story is that the fairy Blackstick, like the fairies in Sleeping Beauty, was invited to the christenings of babies in these neighboring fictional kingdoms. To one generation, she gave stereotypical fairy gifts, like the ability to be beautiful and charming. If you were wearing this magical ring or had in your possession this magical rose. But as these children grew up, the fairy regretted her gifts.
When the story begins, Angelica is the one in possession of the ring, and everyone thinks she's amazing, even though Thackeray makes it clear that she is objectively not. She takes credit for a lot of things that she is not doing, like her homework that she has other people do for her.
It's very funny.
Yes.
Yeah. So the idea is that the fairy Blackstick saw that these gifts kind of corrupted the characters of the recipients.
Yeah, they became narcissistic and just assumed that that everything would be handed to them.
That's right. So for the next generation, the fairy tries something different. She bestows on each child, the two main characters of this book, the gift of a little misfortune.
Which I think this was something we had talked about that I thought was really interesting because just the way it's written, for the two times that she says it, the italicized portion of the phrase is slightly different.
Yeah.
Like, so it's like, that's another thing, like just leaning into the silliness of this story, the lightheartedness of it, something as simple as the tone between, you know, like a little misfortune, you know.
Well, it's a vast understatement in both the story and, if applicable, in Fire Walk with Me, this idea of a little misfortune. I mean, in The Rose in the Ring, Rosalba's family is murdered when she's a toddler. She's presumed eaten by lions, and then she wanders as a ragged little girl into Paphlagonia. She's basically taken in as a pet by Angelica, and when Angelica gets bored of her, she ends up working as her maid. Later in the story, when she's a young adult, she's cast out barefoot into the snow and almost publicly executed. I think that's more than a little misfortune.
I would certainly, if I, you know, was told, well, this was all happening because I gave you just a little misfortune, I would probably shake that fairy like a rag doll. I would be like, a little? You call this a little? I almost got publicly executed, and this is little?
And I think we could say the same for Laura Palmer.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's no such thing as a little misfortune when it comes to Laura.
No,
Right.
It's a lot heavier than that.
Sure is. And then we have the issue, which I think is very interesting, of what we've titled the problem of beauty.
Yeah.
So Rosalba, once she's wearing the ring that Angelica used to wear, is persecuted by everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like by women and by men, because the women hate her. The men are hounding her, being like, you should be with me. I want to be with you. And some of whom seek her gruesome death when she refuses them. You know, it's like the classic, like, if I can't have you, no one should.
And you're going to die in a horrible way.
Yes, like you think you're too beautiful for us. And if we think about the ways that Laura certainly talks about this in The Secret Diary of how troubled she is. I remember like one of the examples for sure was with Josie, where she's like, can't I just have one person who doesn't want me in this way? I just want to connect with someone who doesn't want me like this. And I think that Rosalba could absolutely agree with that, of like, this beauty comes at such a cost, or this you know, having people desiring you comes at such a horrifying cost at times. And it certainly does for Laura. You know, like having Benjamin Horne trying to groom her from a young age to like him, you know, all of these people in her life that prey on her because they're so attracted to her and they want to, you know, have her and possess her in whatever way. It's so concerning.
No, that's absolutely true. I think that a lot of The Secret Diary, and even in the original series, Laura says, like, why is it so easy for me to get men to like me?
Yeah.
It's almost as if this beauty is this superficial power
Yeah.
that she and Rosalba suddenly have. You know, Rosalba doesn't ask for it. Right. She's given this ring by Gruffanuff, another character who thinks it's just kind of a cheap trinket. She puts it on and is suddenly transformed into this irresistibly desirable creature. It's something that's external to herself. Like, it isn't inherent within her. Now she has all this power, but she can't wield it.
No, because she has no idea what to do with it. And that's why with like Angelica, it affected her a little differently because she leaned into it.
Well, and she's protected.
Yeah, she has all of these, adults and guards and
she's
stuff
a
to look out for her.
princess.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, she's going to be guarded like a princess. She wouldn't be put necessarily in these situations. And Rosalba, like Laura, doesn't have that protection, because who would protect Laura? Okay, so her parents, well, her dad is one of her primary abusers, and her mom is incredibly passive and coping with, ways to sort of, disassociate. So she doesn't have that protection. And then any other adults in her life that could have potentially been safe people, like Dr. Jacoby and stuff, like all of these adults that should have been safe, are not protecting her.
Mm-hmm. And is it a function of this beauty, in a sense? The way it is for Rosalba, she goes out into the world just seeking to be treated like a person.
Right.
She's looking for justice. She's trying to get her kingdom back and so forth. And the beauty becomes a hindrance to her. It becomes something that stands in her way.
And that's what happens with Laura as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that's, the way that she grows so exhausted by how people want her, and she just can't have these connections with people without them wanting that from her. It's really heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm. Now, the abuse by her father is not a matter of her beauty.
Yeah.
But I think that the way the other characters in Twin Peaks respond to her, would work for this comparison. I just think it's an interesting issue. We tend to associate great beauty as an advantage. We talk about pretty privilege, and all those sorts of things. But to what extent is it also a kind of curse?
Right. I mean, we're both women, and I know you and I have had conversations before about being catcalled, and things like that. It's one of those tricky things where there's people, especially with the internet, it's so easy to see all these like influencers who are so beautiful, and it's like, oh, I wish I looked more like that person or whatever and stuff. But then at the same time, I don't know, I think I'm like a pretty medium looking person, and I already get, harassed a lot. So I'm like, actually, maybe it would be way worse if I looked like this model that I admire or something. I don't know.
No, I mean, we're led to believe that we can wield beauty to our advantage, but can we?
I don't think we can.
Can Laura? I don't think she can.
Right.
She tries, and certainly Rosalba cannot.
Yeah.
I know you spoke about them both, in a sense, being orphaned girls, too. Not Laura literally, but
Right.
as you said just a little earlier, she is essentially orphaned.
They're both removed or absent in different ways, but that in such a way that lead her to being very alienated and alone in her home. They're not a normal family where they're checking on her and looking out for her and making sure that she's safe around all of these people that are coming into her life.
Yeah. Well, the rose in the ring, as all fairy tales do, or as most fairy tales do, ends very happily. And Rosalba gets her man, and they live happily ever after. And even when she removes the magical ring, he still thinks she's just as beautiful as she was. And then quite entertainingly, Angelica gets the ring back, and her hilariously ugly husband also gets an enchanted object. His name is Bulbo.
Which, I mean, like, as you may have noticed, as we've listed some of the characters, the names alone are meant to be silly.
Yes, but Bulbo has a giant head.
Yes. The illustrations in this are pretty hilarious.
Yeah, Thackeray did them himself. So
yeah, they're very like at the Alice in Wonderland. Yeah.
Yes. So poor Lara, reading this story alone in her room, wrestling with some of the worst human experiences one could possibly have.
Right.
Maybe looking to this sweet little fairy tale of a girl facing similar kinds of problems in her life is hoping for her happy ending as well.
Yeah. No, I think, again, as we said earlier, these types of stories, like fairy tales, are often a great escape for people in these difficult situations where they can look to them and be like, you know what? They got out of this, and so can I. And also, the whole thing is that in these types of fairy tales, the things that they're facing are often so fantastical and so intense. Like Laura's not being thrown to the lions.
No, but I think I'd rather face the lions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but it's like, it's something that she could look at and be like, if she can tame these lions and protect herself against them, then maybe I can also make it through this and protect myself through this.
Yeah. So listeners, now you get to decide what level of connection you think you see here. We've done superficial and some deeper thematic resonances.
Yes.
But yeah. Well, we're going to move on now to the second book, which is The Human Comedy by William Saroyan. Okay, so when Laura's carrying this book, let's set up the context here.
Yeah.
It's later in the film, about an hour and a half in. It's after the pink room scene. It's after Mike confronting Leland in the car. It's Laura has realized that Teresa Banks was wearing the same ring she saw in her dream. She confronts the flickering electrical charge by asking, "Who are you really?" We see Leland's flashback to murdering Teresa. Then Laura uses cocaine before school, and after all of that, we cut to her walking down the school hallway, and she's carrying this book. She sees Bobby, and he tells her about the big score, so this leads right into the scene in the woods with the drug deal, and it's in the middle of all of this intensity that Laura is seen carrying this book.
Yeah, she's just walking down the hallway carrying this book. And unlike the other book, this is one that could possibly be assigned reading for a high school class. We're not sure about it being, so widely read or studied now, but it's literary fiction that may have been classroom worthy in that era. Some of his contemporary critics considered Saroyan one of the most important American authors of the 20th century, likening him to Mark Twain.
Yeah, so it's conceivable that it would have been read in classrooms in this time. Well, according to William J. Fisher in the 1955 article, Whatever Happened to Saroyan? By 1940, quote, Saroyan was a national legend. He was a phenomenally successful author and a familiar public personality, billed as the Great Saroyan in the feature of a popular magazine. He published over 400 stories in 9 collected volumes and in just about every magazine in the country. That's the end of the quote. 3 of Saroyan's plays had been produced on Broadway in 13 months, and he'd won the Pulitzer Prize for one of them. He was just incredibly famous. This was not an obscure writer, not someone only familiar to serious or niche readers.
Yeah. And there are a few ways Lynch could have been familiar with this story of the human comedy to want to include it in the film. It became a best-selling novel a week after its release in 1943, and the film version was released in the same year. Saroyan won an Academy Award for Best Story for it, and in 1959, CBS television aired a well-received adaptation of the novel too. Just as Saroyan was well known, this story was well known and well loved in the era that Lynch was growing up. I do also want to point out, we found out something very funny, which was that we actually sat down last week to try to record this and found that we had 2 entirely different versions of the book.
Yes.
Because, so as I just mentioned, so the book, he had walked off set. He had written the script and he walked off set, decided that he wanted to novelize it. He wasn't happy with the film, which is very Lynchian. He was very committed to his vision. He felt like it wasn't happening. So he said, I'm taking this story and making it a book. And so this is how we ended up with 2 different copies, was that I had found an old vintage copy on Etsy that I just really thought was so beautiful and I wanted to get. And Hilary had the modernized copy.
Yeah, I got the one that Laura Palmer's carrying.
Yes. So it was, he had walked off set, novelized it, and then went back later did a bunch of edits, and then that's that newer version that Hilary and Laura have.
Yeah.
But I had this older version that we only found out because we started talking about our notes before we recorded, and I was like, oh yeah, what about this part? This was crazy when this person said this. And Hilary was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, this, and I pulled out the page, and she pulled up the page in her book, and there were complete lines missing, total huge changes,
Big scenes missing,
Yeah.
chapters. Yeah, it was an extensive revision.
And I think that my version is maybe a little more Lynchian, or like a little weirder.
Sure.
And then I
yeah.
think he went back and he edited it and was like, you know what? I'm going to make this a little more normal. Maybe, perhaps. I don't know.
Maybe so. Well, I know there's another great story about Saroyan insisting on returning the money that MGM gave him for the story. I think, was it $60,000 or something? And maybe in a first and only for a film studio, they refused to take the money back. You know, he was so displeased with the film. But then, of course, he ends up winning an Academy Award for Best Story.
But that, it like lines up with that kind of like Tati Lynch behavior of like, I have
independence.
Yes, I have a very clear vision of this. I don't care about the money. I care about what I want this to look like. And he wasn't happy with what they were doing with it. So he said, I'm taking this story away. I'm going to make my own version.
Another interesting detail I found when I was thinking about how could Lynch have overlapped or had any kind of exposure to this story, that Barry Gifford co-wrote a biography of Saroyan in 1984. So his collaborator, you know, on Wild at Heart and more extensively on Lost Highway, obviously a Saroyan fan.
Yeah. Like, it's one of those things where I feel like a lot of the books that we talk about, like this happened with like Psychic Self-Defense as well, is like, maybe, you know, David didn't read these, but it's totally possible that he's surrounded by these people who did, and, you know, it could have come up in conversation.
Also interesting is that Saroyanesque was an adjective mid-century the way that Lynchian is now. I thought that was so cool.
Yeah.
Saroyan was known for hopeful, optimistic stories that reflected a belief in the inherent goodness of people and in the American dream. His work sharply contrasted that of his more gloomy and cynical contemporaries. Now, in defense of his contemporaries, Saroyan was writing a lot of his optimistic stories during the Great Depression. So, you know, they had a good reason to be more cynical and gloomy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, Lynchian is about juxtaposing the surreal with the mundane, and also for images that emphasize a dreamlike quality of menace or mystery. Saroyanesque was about juxtaposing the hopeful and the optimistic with scenes of poverty and loss.
Yeah, so I like that they're both kind of about these contradictions in a sense.
And the balance. It's always, we talk a lot about Lynch and the balance of the light and the dark. And I think that the human comedy is a great example of that. There's these moments of great sorrow and grief, but then there's also these incredible moments of gentleness and love. Our main character, he's battling with a lot of emotions and a lot of really difficult situations, but at the same time, like, his mom is so incredibly wonderful and insightful and soft with him and gentle with him.
Yeah, I had never read this novel. Had you read it before this?
No,
And
neither of these books.
Yeah, and I thought this was beautiful.
I thought it was really, really lovely. I think when we had talked, I had mentioned that there were even just some parts that just as a reader and a writer, I had bookmarked, not for this podcast, but just as lines that I thought were really just beautifully put.
Me too.
Just the writing itself.
Yes, even if it wasn't in relation to Fire Walk with Me or Twin Peaks, I would have been thrilled to read this novel. Well, to start with the superficial connections, the title, The Human Comedy, seems to come from the 1829 Balzac novels, and Balzac's title is a riff on the Divine Comedy.
So, according to Britannica, the classic conception of comedy, which began with Aristotle in ancient Greece of the 4th century BCE and persists through the present, holds that it is primarily concerned with humans as social beings rather than as private persons, and that its function is frankly corrective. The comic artist's purpose is to hold a mirror up to society to reflect its follies and vices in the hope that they will, as a result, be mended.
Right. So we don't want to think of the human comedy in terms of like LOL stand-up comedy.
Yeah.
It's like the opposite of tragedy.
Yes.
In a sense, it has a different purpose. It usually focuses on more common people than like exalted individuals, the way tragedy does. Comedy also tends to end in good fortune.
Yeah.
So, okay, very superficially then, is there an implication that Fire Walk with Me is more comedy in this traditional sense, not in that it is funny,
Right.
than it is tragedy? You know, is there an implication that Lara is not a tragic hero destroyed by her own flaws, that her misfortune is the result of social problems, not personal shortcomings or flaws? I don't know. What do you think of that?
I mean, it is definitely a very interesting concept because I think for me personally, I focused a lot on Shakespeare in college.
Yeah.
And that's it's the same concept with Shakespeare. People talk about the comedy versus tragedy. And that is something that is always so hard to explain to people because I'll be like, well, this one's a comedy. And they'll be like, well, people died in it. And I'm like, I understand. And yet, and so it's, yeah, I think that nowadays we have this idea of like comedy is like, oh, it's just laughing all the time. You know, it's like an Adam Sandler movie or something, you know, and it's like, no, in like the deep like literature and like specifically like play sense often, it is a lot more complex than that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's easy to read the film and Lara's character arc as one of self-destruction. But is it?
I think that what we see throughout, and especially just having talked about the Rose and the Ring, we touched on it a bit, that she remains hopeful. She remains, hoping and praying.
And fighting.
And fighting till the end for things to be better, and keeps, asking and putting that out there in the universe, looking for, and we see that in the Secret Diary as well. A lot of her entries are her, expressing this pain, but also being like, surely like this will end, or like, I have to stay strong. I have to fight back. And of course she goes through her ups and downs of times where things feel incredibly bleak and she feels battered down, like any classic character. But she remains fighting.
And I don't see her as a tragic hero.
Yeah.
I think she's kind of the opposite. It's her good qualities that ultimately preserve her and save her.
Right.
And it's the forces around her that are trying to pull her down.
Right. Yeah. She's trying so hard to fight against that darkness.
The title, The Human Comedy, might also imply that this is a human story, less than a supernatural one. So if this implies that this is a story about human affairs and not the divine and spiritual, could this suggest that Lara is plagued more by other people, Leland, than she is by a supernatural entity? That this is ultimately a story about human beings harming each other?
I think that's definitely a way to look at it. We, did just talk about all of the people that sort of come for Laura and her beauty was when we sort of were talking about that, just a little bit ago. I think that is a huge part of Laura's pain is her interactions with very human people who are not plagued by the supernatural in the way that Leland is by Bob.
Sure,
Obviously, Bob is a huge part of it. Obviously, the Black Lodge is playing its part in this. But at the end of the day, there are also just a lot of humans making choices that are putting Laura in harm's way.
And have been for
Yes.
her whole young life.
Her whole life.
Right.
So,
Right. Do you think that the term comedy foreshadows the end of the movie, or does it color Laura's fate as a good ending?
I think that in hindsight, and like I think that, you know, if you were asking me this and I was completely unfamiliar with the film,
If you were watching it for the first time.
yeah, you're like watching through it. If I was like sitting through watching it for the first time and somebody was like, it's kind of a comedy, I'd be like, what?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Are you sick?
But
Yeah.
But again, it's that complex definition of comedy, which is so different from how a lot of people associate with the word now. But yeah, I think that there are a lot of moments of hope, and it ends with a lot of possibility, in a way that a tragedy would not.
Right. And although Laura dies, our final image of her is one with like genuine joy.
Right.
And relief and peace.
Relief is the perfect word. Yeah.
Well, we're ready now to move toward more thematic resonances that we see between the human comedy and Fire Walk with Me, and just Twin Peaks in general. The first is that both deal very much with small town life.
Yeah.
Yeah, the human comedy is just like a bunch of vignettes that seem more about developing the human characters or the character of Ithaca, the town in the novel, than furthering the plot.
Yeah, which you can see so much of in Twin Peaks. There is that so much focus on Twin Peaks, like almost as a character itself. And also, you know, we've got all of these like quirky townspeople and stuff. And we get a lot of that in the human comedy. I think one of the first things that I brought up that I just thought was so like I could totally see Lynch finding this hilarious was Mr. Spangler carries around a hard-boiled egg for luck in his pocket. There's like a point where he's like emptying his pockets trying to look for change, and he pulls out a hard-boiled egg, and they're all like, why would you put a hard-boiled egg in your pocket? And he's like, it's lucky. And they're like, okay. And I was like, I could see David having a hoot and a holler about that one.
The pocket egg for luck.
Yeah, like it feels very much like something a character would do in Twin Peaks.
Yes.
Like it's just so silly and quirky and nonsensical.
Well, there's such a sweet story about Homer. Homer's the main character. His little brother Ulysses is 4. And at one point he gets stuck in a hunting trap in a shop.
Yeah.
And it's like the big attraction of the town. No, Ulysses isn't hurt. He's just stuck. And this character who never appears again in the story comes and helps him out of the trap. But truly, like, it doesn't advance a plot.
Yeah.
You know, it's just here to add color to the story and warmth.
Yeah, they're vignettes is the perfect word because they're just these little tiny slice of life stories. And that one also I bookmarked because it felt very like recalcitrant object.
Yes.
And because it's so ridiculous.
Yeah.
He's trapped in this cage and these adults cannot figure out how to get him out. And also I had bookmarked it because the name of the trap was also just very silly. It was Mr. Safferty calls it the lift 'em off their feet, swing them around and hold them Safferty all animal trap.
That might be in your version. I love it.
Wait, are you see that's one of those things, listeners. Like honestly, I think he shouldn't have cut out any of this stuff. I think it was an absolute hoot. But what a silly name. What an absolutely ridiculous funny name for something. I was like, I could totally see this being something that like Nadine would have or something.
Oh, yes.
You know,
Nadine's
she'd be like, I have a
inventions.
new invention. It's the lift them off their feet, swing them around and hold them Safferty all animal trap.
Well, when you think about so many of the vignettes or the little side storylines in Twin Peaks, now I know Twin Peaks was kind of soap opera esque as well, Peyton Place, that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
but these little vignettes throughout Twin Peaks also just kind of build the character of the town, like you said. They're more about like the human story, as opposed to we're gonna further the murder mystery.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's like there is a lot of like there is obviously a solid plot line through the book. And it is a difficult one. But at the same time, yeah, there's like these little vignettes. There's like, you know, him fighting with his classmates at school.
Yeah.
And how silly that it all is. There's like one part where he's like racing against a classmate, and the like
Yeah.
gym teacher is like mad about it and like grabs him.
Yeah.
There's like all of these like silly little moments, you know, interspersed throughout, that honestly, I feel like that is very Lynchian, because we talk about a lot how he's so good at bringing in these comedic moments to lighten things.
Oh, yeah.
When it starts to get really heavy. So it's like, you know, we'll have Homer grappling with delivering telegrams about dead soldiers, and then we have him being all plucky with his classmates at school.
Yeah.
And his
Yeah.
brother getting stuck in a cage.
Sure. Yeah. There is that, well, you've just alluded to it with the telegrams,
Yeah.
that this is a warm little community, but it is plagued on its periphery by darkness,
Yeah.
just as Twin Peaks is.
Right.
Yeah. So there is the central role of the telegraph in the human comedy that I think connects very nicely with all of the electricity, the telephones in Twin Peaks and Fire Walk with Me. So 14-year-old Homer gets his first job as a telegram messenger. So we're going to presume that most of us have not sent or received telegrams.
What a lost art.
What a lost art. But, you know, the telegraph was our country's first electrical infrastructure. So what now are telephone poles or electricity poles were originally telegraph poles. So this was our first telecommunications, obviously, but also our first electrical infrastructure. And since that number 6 pole is so important in Fire Walk with Me and in Twin Peaks The Return, you know, that would have originally been a telegraph pole also.
Oh, good
Yeah.
point.
But anyway, so how it works is that messages were sent via Morse code over the telegraph lines. And so at either end would be telegraph operators who would be responsible for sending and receiving these messages. In this little office in Ithaca, there's Mr. Grogan who operates the telegraph machine, and so he'll translate the messages and type them up then out of code into English. There's Mr. Spangler who manages the office, and then there's Homer who delivers the telegrams. In this era, this little office already would have been kind of anachronistic because is it called the teletype machine?
Yes, multiplexes and teletypes.
So that's what would have existed in most telegraph offices at this point. But Mr. Grogan is like hanging on, isn't he?
It's very, like, this was something that felt very Tati or like Lynchian, because, I love this part. He says, "They've been wanting to retire me for years," he shouted. "They've been wanting to put in the machines they're inventing all over the place. Multiplexes and teletypes," he said with contempt. "Machines instead of human beings."
Mr. Grogan thinks he's better than the machine, though, right?
Right. And it's like, that was something that we also talked about, was that, especially with stuff like this, these are like really delicate messages.
Yes, because this is during World War II.
Right. And so a lot of these telegrams are from soldiers to their families. We get a couple of those in the book. And then there's also telegrams that are announcing deaths.
From the War Department.
And so, like, these people deserve at least that much dignity, that a human being is conveying this message rather than a machine.
Yeah.
And so it's like this little telegraph's office, you know, their fight for keeping it human is such a beautiful cause.
It is.
Because it's so true that a machine could not do that job justice in the way that Mr. Grogan is dedicated to making these communications possible.
You know, a truly lovely way I think this overlaps with Twin Peaks, and I'm not saying this is intentional, but in the way that Lucy answers and interacts with the phones in the sheriff's department, you know, she brings an extremely human element to that. The way she speaks over the intercoms, the way she, even in the very first pilot episode, is saying like it's going to be to this phone over by where we moved this chair. You know, she could just transfer the call by pushing the button, but Lucy's going to bring the human element to all of it.
It's like it's like kind of like the you know, Tati vibe of, you know, I don't care if it's kind of clunky. I don't care if it's kind of outdated. I would rather this charm over this hyper robotic, whatever, cold, you know, keep it personal, keep it between human beings. I mean, it's kind of like our fight against AI right now.
Yeah.
This is like, you know, like an earlier example of like, you know, these machines trying to take people's jobs.
Yeah, right. And absolutely removing the human soul from it.
Yeah, because I think that's a perfect word, soul. This is something that should be done with soul. And that is the one thing that we will always have over machines. Yes, AI can make art, but it doesn't have a soul.
It can write.
But it doesn't have a soul. Well, I mean, that's the thing. Reading AI writing is... Have you gotten any as a teacher?
Yes, I have.
But that you can always tell.
You can tell immediately.
Because it makes no sense.
Someone online somewhere described it as writing flavored content. And I love that phrase. Yeah, that's how I think about AI writing. It is writing flavored.
Yeah, anytime I've read anything that is, I'm just like stumbling over the words like, this is just not...
It means nothing.
This is gibberish.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. But... you know, even in Twin Peaks The Return, when Lucy cannot comprehend cell phones.
Yeah.
You know, Lucy understands the wired telephone. Like that level of technology she can connect with and make sense of. But cell phones are just a whole other layer. She can't, right? That's so removed from her human experience.
Right. And then that's like another example of that sort of like aging out of this technology. And the way that it pushes people out. It really alienates people. I mean, even sometimes when my phone updates, and it's like a new Apple update or something, and I'm like, where's this app now? Or like, how do I use this thing now? Because the format's so different, and I like feel like, and it like, I'm like, am I like 1,000,000 years old? Like, why is this so confusing? Why is my photo app confusing now? You know? So I feel Lucy on that, and I feel Mr. Grogan on that.
Right. Well, Homer's hired to... Homer, our main character, is hired to deliver telegrams on his bicycle throughout Ithaca. And his very first delivery on his first day of work as a 14-year-old is it's from the War Department to a woman whose son has been killed in action. He'll deliver a variety of messages throughout the novel, but this steady drip and constant threat of these messages of death set the tone for his work and the work of the telegraph office in general.
And what's interesting about this scene, too, is that this was one of the first ones that showed us that we had different versions.
Oh, yeah.
Because we sat down and I was like, yeah, this scene was like kind of scary. And you were like, she does not say all that.
Yes,
like,
this is Mrs. Sandoval, the first delivery.
And so, and this was a scene that jumped out to me as unnerving in a Lynchian way. Like, this could totally be someone that, you know, Lara might encounter and have like this unsettling encounter, you know, this would look good on your wall.
Yes.
You know, and so it's like he you know, shares the message with her, and this woman starts to unravel, and she like gives him this candy, and it's intense. She's like, "Here," she said, "eat this candy. All boys like candy." Homer took a piece of the candy from the box, put it into his mouth, and tried to chew. "You would not bring me a bad telegram," she said. "You are a good boy, like my little Juanito when he was a little boy. Eat another piece." And she made the messenger take another piece of the candy. Homer sat chewing the dry candy while the Mexican woman talked. "It is our own candy," she said, "from cactus. I make it for my Juanito when he come home, but you eat it. You are my boy too." Now suddenly she began to sob, holding herself in as if weeping were a disgrace. Homer wanted to get up and run, but he knew he would stay. He even thought he might stay for the rest of his life. He just didn't know what else to do to try to make the woman less unhappy. And if she had asked him to take the place of her son, he would not have been able to refuse because he would not have known how. And it goes on, and it's just like, you know, there's like a part where she grabs him and she goes, my little boy," and it's so intense, and he's so shaken up by this.
Yeah.
And this is his first day, and again, he's 14, which, and that's another part of this too, is that the position is supposed to be for no one younger than 16.
Yeah.
But he lies because his family really needs the money. And so he's desperately like trying to get this job, and they're really nice, and they're like, "Okay, you know, you seem like a very smart, responsible young boy, so we're going to let you do it even though we know that you're underage."
Right.
And it's like, was it worth it? Maybe.
Yeah, because it's so deeply
it's so
traumatizing.
rough. And when he gets home, his mom is so lovely with him, and so comforting, thankfully, because he just comes in, and she can tell the second she sees him, she's like, "What's going on?"
And this isn't the only time. You know, this
No.
happens throughout the novel.
Right.
You know, I think that he says that it's simultaneously the best thing that's ever happened to him and the worst,
Right.
you know, having this job. But it is really important that these messages from the darkness come through telegraph wires and poles, through electricity.
Yeah.
And the telegraph operators are really good, but they're very troubled men. So like Mr. Grogan is an alcoholic whose drinking seems directly related to these messages of death. Like he's this sweet and kind man to Homer, but he drinks himself unconscious.
Right.
You know,
he
as-
even says like to Homer when he starts, he's like, "So if you see me in the office and I'm, you know, like blackout drunk, pour water over me and
Yeah.
give me a coffee."
It's part of Homer's job.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that the burden of receiving these messages is very heavy in this novel. You know, it takes a real toll on these humans. So even though they want to do this job, that it is better for them to do it than a machine,
Right.
they are suffering.
Well, and Mr.
because of
Grogan
it.
is the one who says a machine could not do this. But meanwhile, he's drinking himself to death because he's so overcome with this. And ultimately, he ends up having a heart attack while he is typing up the telegram that says that Homer's older brother Marcus has died in the war. He is so overcome by it that he's mid-typing it out, and he has a heart attack.
Yeah.
Which is so heartbreaking.
Yeah. And then Homer has to deliver. Homer is charged with delivering that telegram to his own family.
Right. After seeing Mr. Grogan die also.
Yeah.
Which is just, it's so much for a 14-year-old boy.
Yeah, and we just finished not too long ago talking about how beautiful this novel is. And now these kinds of details are so heavy. But you'll just have to trust us that Saroyan conveys it with such lovely, hopeful, ultimately redemptive language.
Well, and I think it is not unusual for a lot of like wartime books like this, where it's like Here's the ways where they found little pockets of joy. Here's the times where they still had a joyful day at school with their classmates. Here's a time where they still had a sweet, tender moment with their mother, despite the fact that this war was raging on. People they loved were dying. There's like a moment where like his older sister and their friend meet some soldiers and go to the movies and stuff, just to like have a nice day together. Like they don't know these boys, but they're just like, it's like everyone is determined to sort of look out for each other. The book starts off with this, and it's brought up a couple times throughout the book, that Ulysses, his younger brother, has this incredibly joyful moment that sticks with him, and he brings it up throughout the book that this was one of the happiest things that ever happened to him, which is so cute, because he's a little boy, so he's like, this was the best thing ever. Was just like a soldier waving back to him on the train.
Oh, I don't think it was a soldier, but it is a man.
It's just like the kindness of, it's one of those things that I think people talk about a lot, where they're like, whatever happened to being able to just wave to people on the street and have that like neighborly camaraderie. And this is like such a hallmark of that. And I feel like that's a vibe that we get. Like, we know that David loves this kind of stuff. We see it in Blue Velvet. We see it in The Straight Story. We see it in Twin Peaks. He loves the small town friendliness, these interactions that are so human and so inviting and friendly just between people, where they're looking out for each other even if they don't know each other well, or if they are all neighbors, there's this incredible closeness. Yeah, and he talks about that in Room to Dream too, and like has talked about it in interviews where he's like, things were different back then. It felt safer. You could just be out playing with your friends so late. Everybody knew each other.
It is pretty remarkable how little Ulysses at 4 years old like wanders the streets.
Oh my gosh, that's how he ends up in a cage.
He just wanders around.
He just wandered up to the store and was like, oh, what's this cage? And hopped right in.
What a different time. Now a 10-year-old goes to the playground by herself here in America, and the parents are arrested for child neglect.
It's just, it's a completely different time. And even the kid that finds Ulysses and tells Homer is like a fellow small child who's selling newspapers. And he's like, he's so cute. He's like, I make my rounds around town, and these days I have this paper, and on these days I have this paper. He's a little entrepreneur.
I saw a connection with telecommunications, the telegraph, the telephone, being the conduit for messages of death with the pilot of Twin Peaks, which, Fire Walk With Me could be foreshadowing a little bit here, where the way Sarah receives the news of Lara's death over the phone and the way the camera traces that chord as she's wailing and screeching in grief. Wow, that's just an updated version of what we see here in the human comedy, with just the absolute worst pain, the worst messages you can possibly receive coming to you through these electrical wires.
Yeah. And like, I just thinking of that sort of that like scene and performance, that's very much like Mrs. Sandoval too.
Oh yes.
Like, I see such a correlation between those. I mean, of course a mother hearing the death of her child is going to respond intensely, or I would hope so. But yeah, that like intense emotional scene feels very in line with that scene in the human comedy as well.
I'm watching Twin Peaks with my 18-year-old now, and we're only, 5 episodes in. It's such a joy. But she said, this show is so much about grief. And yes, of course. And I love hearing that from a new viewer too.
Well, and it's like about how all of these characters are shaped by this grief, especially the young characters.
Sure.
Because these are their most formative years, when they are like becoming adults. and they're figuring out who they want to be in the world. And then this light in their life is, snuffed out.
Right.
And under insane circumstances.
Well, and that's one of the parallels we saw with the human comedy.
Yeah.
Was this coming of age through grief.
Yeah.
This novel is Homer coming of age with this heavy responsibility of his job as a messenger, and the impact of this is so profound. To go back to that first scene with Mrs. Sandoval, he even, like, desperate to take her pain away, says, like, oh, maybe it's a mistake.
Yeah.
Maybe he's not really dead. And later, the novel says, he didn't dislike the woman, but what was happening to her seemed so wrong and so unnecessary that he didn't know if he ever wanted to go on living even.
Right.
And then she thinks, just like Sarah thinks that Donna is Laura briefly.
Yeah.
She thinks he's her boy.
Right. It's this like surrogate in the moment where you are so overcome with grief that you're like, I just need to hold somebody. I need someone to be them. I need them to be here. And you're just, you're blinded by this grief completely. Just,
And for as difficult as it is for an older person to confront that kind of grief, I think you're right. There is something about being young and, you feel like you're immortal.
Yes.
You don't really consider mortality or that you will one day no longer exist.
Right.
When someone also young dies, there is something at the end of the novel where Homer reflects on his father's death.
Yeah.
And he says, I was sad, but I wasn't sore, I think, or angry, because he'd had a good life.
Yeah.
He had a family and all this stuff. But like with his brother's death, he's devastated because he's a young man. His potential has not yet been explored and fulfilled.
Right. Well, there's this part where his brother sends him this letter that's pretty heartbreaking, just being like, I love you so much. You're the best of us. And I'm glad that it was me. It's so sad. He's like, I'm glad it was me that went to war because you're better than I am. And if one of us brothers has to live, I would hope it would be you. And after Homer reads it, he says, this is so sad. He spoke very softly. If my brother is killed in this stupid war, he said, I shall spit at the world. I shall hate it forever. I won't be good. I shall be the worst of them all, the worst that ever lived.
So sweet. But he isn't, of course, right?
No.
Thanks to the kind adults in his life, he does.
Yeah.
We do get a sense that he's going to reconcile this and find a way to go on. But I think with a young person's death like Laura's, so if we contrast it with like the death of the log lady and the return, that's certainly a moment of just profound grief in the return. But it's different than the grief we feel for Laura's death.
Yeah.
There is something about the death of a young person, especially when you are a young person,
Right.
that's so shocking and so unnatural and so horrifying that it does change you.
Well, and that's something that I know we had talked about with our In Cold Blood episode.
Oh, yeah, of
was
course.
like with like Nancy Clutter, all of Nancy's like classmates and the townspeople could not get over the fact, could not grapple with the fact that this young woman who had such a potential and so much ahead of her was taken away like that in her prime. It's like they talked so much about how she was going to go on to do all these great things and go to college and all this kind of stuff. And it's the same for Laura, where it's like, what could her, it's impossible for her friends not to think about what the future might have looked like for Laura and all of the great things that she might have done, because she was such a light.
I mean, later in the novel, Homer tells Mr. Grogan that he wishes he didn't have to deliver the death telegrams. And he says, quote, if a fellow dies that way, somebody you know or somebody you don't know, somebody you've never seen, they don't just die for nothing, do they? And Mr. Grogan pauses for a long time, and then he answers that he doesn't know the answer, and he isn't even sure there is one. He says, "It's a young question, and I'm an old man." I love that moment in the novel, and I do think that it illustrates that discrepancy of coping with grief as a young person versus an older one. You know, and since Twin Peaks is so much about young people coping with grief, I thought that was really important. It's a young question, and I'm an old man.
Well, yeah, because I would say I feel like a lot of the, just thinking about that now, like a lot of the younger characters in Twin Peaks are like, well, let's figure this out. Like they've got this like justice mindset, and a lot of like the older characters, you know, like Sarah and Leland and like Benjamin and stuff like, and Harold and Jacoby, like all of them, they just kind of like devolve a bit. Like they like really like lose their minds, and like don't cope with it in healthy ways. Not that the kids are necessarily coping in healthy ways. I mean, because we've got Donna trying to be cool, but you know, oh, I'm Donna, I smoke cigarettes now. But you like my Donna voice?
I do very much. And the listeners can't see your Donna face.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
I'm doing, this is like the face that I make when I'm mimicking someone I don't like, maybe. But yeah, we've got like, they are more like James and Donna are like, let's figure this out.
Yeah,
Let's
it's like
solve
they
a
want
crime.
to make meaning out of it.
Yes,
or they want to
looking
find
for an
the
answer.
meaning.
The adults have seen enough death in their lives that they're like, I don't need to make meaning out of this. I am just sad.
Right.
And I'm just going to grieve, and maybe I need to wallow. Maybe I need to drink. You know, like with Sarah, she really devolves into addiction, and it's like those are like the adult coping mechanisms. Meanwhile, like Bobby has like this great character arc.
Sure.
You know,
Yeah.
like it's like for some of the for the younger characters, yeah, they're like looking to get answers, find meaning, and you know, maybe almost kind of like live for Laura, live a little harder, or like with more gusto.
Right, right. I know the Log Lady intro to episode 16 or episode 9, depending on the numbering. It's the episode Arbitrary Law, right? Of course, so that's where the killer is revealed.
Yeah.
The Log Lady intro states, "So now the sadness comes, the revelation. There is a depression after an answer is given. It was almost fun not knowing. Yes, now we know. At least we know what we sought in the beginning, but there is still the question why. And this question will go on and on until the final answer comes. Then the knowing is so full, there is no room for questions." So I wanted to include that because I really liked how it connected with Homer's question there. But also, doesn't the language of that even sound like something Saroyan would write?
That like very much feels like, especially his conversations with his mom.
Yes.
She's so unbelievably insightful. There were so many like quotes that the mom said that I had to bookmark because I was just like, this is just so moving that I want to take this into my heart.
But like also very strange.
Yes.
And profound. It's not like the kind of stuff you would put on a greeting card moving.
This is not normal mom conversation where
Right.
it's like, oh, honey, it's okay. She's saying these like things that I'm just like,
They're a little spooky.
well, like now my mind is kind of like reeling and exploding.
Do you remember the story about Eraserhead when officials, I guess, at the AFI first watched like the scene with the X's, and one of the comments in exasperation was, "People don't talk that way."
Oh, I think I remember this. Yeah.
Yeah, but sometimes I thought that when I not in exasperation, but when I was reading the human comedy, I was like, people do not talk this way.
Yeah, well, it's like
But maybe they should.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like I have like a mom that I'm very lucky. She's got a very gentle heart and is extremely intelligent and very insightful. Very, you know, I could see her as this sort of type, but even she doesn't talk this way.
Yeah.
Like I could see her expressing similar ideas, but not in that language.
Yeah, so I think a good example of this also ties in with what we were just talking about, because Homer, as he's continuing to grapple with the heaviness of his responsibility of delivering these telegrams, being the messenger of death, basically, he talks to his mother. This is quite late in the novel, where he's thought that as a fellow grew up, he would never cry. But he says, but it seems as if that's when a fellow starts, because that's when a fellow starts finding out about things. He says, almost everything a man finds out is bad or sad. It's so sweet. Like, what an expression of growing up. You know, almost everything we find out is bad or sad. But his mother goes on to this, like, really beautiful story. She says, unless a man has pity, he is not truly a man. If a man has not wept at the world's pain, he is only half a man, and there will always be pain in the world. A good man will seek to take pain out of things. A foolish man will not even notice it, except in himself. And the poor, unfortunate, evil man will drive pain deeper into things and spread it about wherever he goes. But I really loved that description of a good, foolish, and evil man, you know, and their relationship to the world and pain.
I feel like that, like, yeah, that is like a perfect example of, again, it's like you could totally have a character express that concept in more, I don't know, I hate to say like normal terms,
Like,
or like
conversational.
Yeah, conversational. But yeah, she delivers these concepts and thoughts in this like very eloquent philosophical way. Like, I mean, I'd love to have like a cocktail with her, you know.
Well, we wondered if it's a translation thing.
That's the other thing too. That is a huge part of this. And also this book is dedicated to his mother.
Yeah.
And even says in the note that he wonders if it will come across better in translation.
Because his family, we should say, is Armenian.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that is also a very interesting thing. And then it's like, you also have to wonder, he's dedicating this to his mother. He obviously makes the mother character incredibly insightful, again, like very, very intelligent, well-spoken, and extremely kind. And so I wonder like how much of a reflection that is on his own mother.
I'm sure it's a big reflection.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Homer's comment about, you know, or his conclusion that everything a man learns is bad or sad, it really reminded me of James in that same episode, Arbitrary Law, where he says, it doesn't matter. Nothing we do matters. Nothing's ever going to change. It doesn't matter if we're happy and the world goes to hell. Yeah. And this is right before he rides off and Donna's screaming, James, don't leave me. Right. And it is easy to laugh at that scene a little or smirk at it. But it is a very similar, profound expression of the meaninglessness of grief, because this is after Maddie's death.
Right.
That this is too horrible for a young mind to hold.
Right.
And how can anything have joy? How can we have meaning in life?
Right.
In the face of this kind of loss and grief? And that's what Homer's grappling with in the human comedy as well.
Right. They're so young and they're having so much loss and grief thrown on their plate, and they're just trying to make sense of it however they can, and it's very difficult.
Yeah, they're just gutted by it.
Yeah.
Another part of this coming of age through death that we see as a shared theme, we also have this dream of the double that Homer has. So Homer has a nightmare in the novel where he sees himself. He sees a double of himself, perhaps a doppelganger.
Yeah.
But he understands that this double is the messenger of death. So they're both on bicycles in the dream, and he starts to pursue his double in order to prevent him from bringing the darkness to Ithaca. He rides as fast as he can. He manages to kind of chase him off. But then at the last moment, the double turns and returns to Ithaca, and he knows, you know, that he's bringing death. or the message of death. So he fails. And wow, because doubles and doppelgangers are all over Twin Peaks, like it's really hard not to see that resonance.
And dreams are such an important thing in Lynch, anything Lynch has done in general. Lynch is obviously a huge believer in dreams having meaning. And this is like kind of a traditional approach to, like dreams are our subconscious working through the things that we don't know how to process. And this dream makes complete sense with everything that's going on in Homer's life. And he's very troubled by it.
Oh, yeah. I think with the original series ending with both like Black Lodge Lara, and this Lara who whispers sweetly in Cooper's ear, but then there's like the doppelganger Lara just screaming rage at him. The double with kind of with different intentions or purposes really resonates in Twin Peaks too.
So the last topic we wanted to bring up is the isolation of the receivers. Again, we had kind of talked about how the people that work at the telegraph office, they're sort of isolating in different ways. They are, affected by this burden, this heavy burden to bear in different ways. With Mr. Grogan, it's the drinking. With Mr. Spangler, he's got this girlfriend that like, she's so eager to give him this love and he just like can't accept it. And he's like building this wall between having relationships, which I mean makes sense if you're getting messages about death every day.
Sure.
You don't want to have someone in your life that you could lose. So when we look at the characters in Twin Peaks and Fire Walk with Me,
who are receivers.
Yeah, who are the receivers? We were thinking, of course, the Log Lady.
Yes.
We're thinking Sarah Palmer. We're thinking Harold Smith. These are people that receive messages in different ways. Like they all kind of have their own flavor of it.
Right.
But they are all in their own ways receivers of messages.
Well, the Log Lady is probably the most obvious of them. And you were the one who pointed this out in our episode meeting that she receives the messages on behalf, or she receives messages from the log for the town. Yeah. And then she has to deliver them very much like a telegraph operator.
She shows up. She'll show up wherever and be like, hi, my log has something to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
And people will pause. People will pause what they're doing and turn and receive the message.
But she herself is quite isolated.
Yeah. Yeah, like physically she's living alone, kind of secluded a bit. And even just like with her interactions with the townspeople, it's not like we see her per se gabbing with the gals. She's not out like having, a big lunch with a big group at the diner or something.
No, we see her at the diner, but she's alone.
She's always very isolated and alienated from the community, but it feels like she isolates herself a lot in ways, but also that people do sort of, there are totally some people that seem to be a little more reserved around her maybe, and or like weirded out maybe a little bit, but overall people do respect her, I think.
Yeah, they accept the role that she plays in the town, but there may be a burden there.
Yeah, it definitely feels like it's more that she's the one keeping that wall there. Yeah. And she will let people in at times, but mostly she keeps to herself.
Either in Fire Walk with Me or The Missing Pieces, at this moment, it's escaping me which, that we see Margaret like in her cabin as Leland is passing with Lara and Ronette, and she is just sobbing and terrified. We have this sense that like the bearer of the wisdom, the message, is very, very burdened and lonely and isolated.
Right. It's similar to telegrams in that sometimes it's not always death telegrams. With Margaret, it's not always something terrifying
No,
or
right.
dark. Sometimes she just has wisdom to impart, but sometimes she has very painful news to share. And
Well-
she doesn't get to choose.
Right. Right.
Which is part of like what plays into that with her and with the people working with the telegrams. It's like you have no idea what's going to come through to you.
That's true. Like you just receive the message.
Yeah.
Now, you also identified Sarah as a receiver.
Yeah. I mean, her visions, and then she, like Mr. Grogan, numbs herself with alcohol and cigarettes and copes with it in that way that he sort of does as well. And is ultimately like Mr. Grogan destroying her body in that way because of this heavy burden. And when she has visions, it's very visceral. She's always very distraught, I feel. So
Yeah, and like Margaret, like the telegraph operators, you don't have control over what comes through.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just get hit with it, and you just have to somehow figure out how you want to process it.
Well, and then there's Harold Smith, who's a little different because he's not receiving messages from the unseen.
Yeah.
But he is a receiver of stories.
Right. It's in the same way that Mr. Grogan is typing up these Morse code messages almost. It's like Harold is receiving this information and these stories from people and then compiling them, and sort of being a library of this information. Which is, again, it's just like they've all kind of got their different ways of being receivers, whether it is messages through the log, whether it is visions, whether it is receiving this information from people. They are all receiving these communications, and then they have to deal with them however they do. And kind of like we were saying with the log lady, Harold is one that he isolates so much. And I think even the way that he's so meticulous with his plants is like that. It's like the classic, you feel like you can't control anything, but this is something you can control.
Yeah.
It's like you're so desperate to have control over something that takes, all this like meticulous little details and
Sure,
care.
like orchids,
Yeah,
right? They need very
because
precise care.
It's so specific. And so maybe, he's feeling like he can't control the outside, so he isolates and he picks something that he can control to feel a little bit of sanity.
He collects these stories, but he lives this very isolated life. Then he dies a lonely soul.
Right.
And,
And honestly, he's such a fairy tale character.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Him living in his isolated little...
The hermit.
Yeah, the hermit. The hermit, and like, it could totally be a character that you would stumble upon in a fairy tale. He would live in a little cottage in the woods with his magical flowers or something that he so meticulously cares for, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and then he becomes the receiver of Laura's truth.
Yeah.
And is supposed to hold that. So that wraps up our discussion of the books of Fire Walk with Me. But our next episode, coming up in April,
is actually one that our friend Colin from Creamed Corn in the Universe had sort of asked if we might be touching on this sometime soon. And I said, actually, Colin, I would love to do that. Let me convince Hilary. And she was very easily convinced. We're going to be comparing the works of Satoshi Kon and David Lynch.
Now, this is a discussion that I've seen bubbling on the internet for a long time.
Yeah.
I haven't watched Satoshi Kon's films until you said, let's do this episode.
He is one of my favorite directors and go-to comfort films.
Just outstanding so far. I'm really enjoying them. But I can see that fans have been talking about this for a couple of decades now. So we're excited to have that conversation too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll talk about them and dreams and what reality is.
As usual.
Yes, as we often do.
But until then, please keep your topic suggestions coming, just like Colin reaching out with this one. We're looking forward to incorporating all the great suggestions we've been receiving in future episodes.
And if you want to keep up with us, and also, as always, I'll be posting images so that you can sort of see side-by-side comparisons or, images to go along with the things that we've mentioned. You can check us out on Instagram at Full Blossom of the Evening. And if you want to get in touch with us with any episode ideas you have, you can DM us there, or you can email us at fullblossomoftheeveningpodcast@gmail.com.
So thank you for listening to the Full Blossom of the Evening. And we'll sign off with...
It was Laura, and she's come to kiss you goodbye.
Goodbye, listeners.
Goodbye.
Gary, I have no idea where this will lead us, but I have a definite feeling it will be a place both wonderful and strange.
It was Laura. And I saw her glowing. I saw her